Hi. Okay, guys. So we're going to just have kind of an intro lesson here about literary analysis because we're going to spend a lot of the first half of the year, especially working on analyzing literature for accuracy and for interpretation. So let's get started. Okay. So this book is a book called How to Read Literature Like a Professor. That's where I got this whole lesson from. The advanced placement students are required to read it. You guys, it's not required reading, but I still think it might be useful for you to learn some of the pointers that Thomas Foster gives to students who are just now starting to read literature on a higher level. So this is kind of an intro to English Lit 101, and it's called How to Read Literature Like a Professor because there's certain things that English professors kind of innately know because they've been around literature for so long and have read so many things that you pick up on patterns that you see from work to work. And when you learn to see those patterns, that's where you learn to interpret with accuracy. You learn to find patterns that indicate meaning in the literature, and that's how you're able to form an argument and write a good essay about, any given poem or play or novel or short story. Okay, so what is literary analysis? We all know analysis means to pull things apart in an attempt to locate those meanings. So we look for patterns within a piece of fiction or poetry, and that's how we make a good argument grounded in the text for what the text might mean. Authors rely on a few common devices that are meant to trigger meaning for the reader. And so what we want to get good at is finding those common patterns. So one major pattern that's very easy to spot is the idea of a quest. So whenever a character moves from one spot to another spot over the course of a story, we can consider that quest an epic journey. Okay. And whether it's a book like The Hobbit from Tolkien, where we have major fantasy level adventures with lots of action, or The Odyssey, if you guys remember from ninth grade, Odysseus moves from the Trojan War back to his home in Ithaca, and along the way he has many different adventures and changes as a result of those adventures. Or it could be as simple as a story that you guys are going to read where a young boy goes to a street fair, learns a lesson, and then comes home. So the point is that when characters physically move, oftentimes that physical movement indicates some kind of change in emotional or spiritual quality. So never every trip is an obvious quest like The Hobbit or a King Arthur legend, something really action and adventure. Sometimes characters move in very small ways, but that movement still indicates important development. So physical movement a lot of times equals emotional development. And the characters at the end of their journey or their quests are often different than the characters they were when they began that journey. Okay, eating. You guys are going to read some stories in this unit and later on where people eat together. And there's no reason for any author of a fictional piece to describe people eating unless it has symbolic content behind it. So eating usually indicates people sitting down, having communion with each other. And that doesn't mean communion in the literal sense or the spiritual sense or religious sense. Sometimes it just means that they're sharing a moment together. If you know what communion means in a religious sense, that would be sharing bread and a meal together, but not just with each other, but also with the divine. So sometimes eating might have a spiritual component when an author is trying to depicts that eating, he might be indicating a higher level of communion. But sometimes it's really just about a family sitting together or friends sitting together and sharing a moment of communion with each other. If the meal falls apart and everything goes wrong, then that also might have an important meaning, that the family is falling apart. It might symbolize that things are falling apart on an emotional level as well. So communion and eating always has some sense of symbolism behind it. You need to be thinking about what the author might be trying to convey through that very common idea of communion. Right. Another version of eating is a character that does it in a vampiric way. Now, if you are familiar with books like Twilight or Dracula or any of the other vampire novels, there's many, many versions of this in different kinds of literature for young adults and adults. But a vampire is a monster that literally eats a weaker person to put his own ugly desires first at the expense of another. So the subtext originally for vampires, when they were created in 19th century literature, was a way to kind of discuss sex, but to do it through to address it indirectly. And oftentimes authors were trying to sort of hide their address sex indirectly to avoid censorship. Okay. Symbolic vampire, though, can be trickier to spot. Sometimes characters don't literally eat each other, but a character can be really selfish and exploitive and place his or her ugliness, his ugly physical desire, above the needs of another. So if you see a character who is, kind of a villain character that depletes another character, it might be sort of a symbolic vampire. We have no real vampires in our unit, no Draculas, but we will have one character who will put his ugly desire above another, and that makes him a villain in a certain kind of way. And it happens that villain will be sharing a meal with other characters, and so you try to spot exactly what that might mean, what the connotations might mean. Okay, just like there's no reason for an author to describe eating unless it has symbolism, weather is also important symbolically. There's no reason for an author to describe a rainstorm, for example, unless it has symbolism and some kind of meaning behind it. So commonly, snow indicates death or isolation, paralysis. Sometimes characters are literally frozen, but they are also frozen spiritually. The earth is quiet, but in a quiet, deadened sort of way instead of a peaceful way. The exception to snow imagery oftentimes would be unless you're reading a holiday story where characters are the snow is part of the festive season. So depending on how the snow is used or how winter imagery is used, that's going to indicate a certain kind of meaning. Rain also is usually about images of springtime and fertility, but it can also indicate drowning or misery. In many Gothic novels, a rainstorm will happen, a crack of thunder might happen just before a moment of important plot. So it could be there for emphasis. So you want to be thinking about whenever weather is described, how is it being used? What is the symbolism? All right, if you've ever been asked, is that a symbol by an English teacher? That was a trick question. The answer is always yes, but there is no definite meaning unless the story is an allegory where things directly match up to famous historical figures or larger concepts. So, for example, the novel Animal Farm, I know some people read that in middle school. Every animal in Animal Farm matches up to a direct historical event or something direct from the Russian Revolution. But most of the time, symbols that we will encounter in this class won't have one set meaning. It'll be open to interpretation. But there's no reason for an object or a person to be described in a piece of literature in depth unless it's there for meaning, unless it's contributing to the meaning of the story on the whole. So think about how in a painting, an artist might paint every line, and that's going to contribute to the painting. Authors have details in their stories, symbols, and those symbols can contribute to the meaning of the overall story. And that's where you're going to find interpretation. Okay, Christ figures, we will specifically have characters that share common traits of Christ from the New Testament. That doesn't mean that the characters are there to be Christ exactly, but we're meant to think of certain types of characters as Christ figures. And that might just mean that they're very self-sacrificing or they're spiritual in some sort of way. They have followers or disciples. Very oftentimes, Christ figures will show kindness. So, for example, in the novel Lord of the Flies, we will see a character who exhibits these tendencies, and that's why we can interpret him as a Christ figure. And this is not specifically just limited to male figures. Christ figures in literature symbolically that can work through female characters as well. Okay, so be thinking about that. Okay, when characters fly, it can be dangerous. If you know the ancient story of Daedalus and Icarus flying too close to the sun, the wings melting, and Icarus falling to the earth to his death. That's a story about excitement and pride. Icarus is so thrilled at being able to fly that his wings melt and he falls to the earth. But flying can also symbolize freedom. So depending, when characters fly, it might be one of those two types of meanings. Okay, sexual imagery. So ideas of femininity and masculinity are always present in literature because all literature deals with men and women. So when you're looking for symbolism that's connected to male and female sexuality, you want to be thinking about signs of fertility or masculinity. Coded sexual images very oftentimes can be more intense than literal sexual imagery. In the past, just like we talked about with vampires, authors had to write about sex indirectly to avoid censorship. So, but sexual imagery is always, worked into the literature that we will cover. It doesn't mean that the literature is specifically about sex. Again, it could just be about issues of masculinity and femininity. But you want to be thinking about that when you are interpreting, even, as we'll see in this unit, just a simple conversation between a man and a woman will have that sort of imagery woven into the text. And that's where you want to try to pick up on that symbolic meaning. Okay, so it is always about sex. Okay, except when it is about sex. When authors write directly about sex, when characters actually are romantically involved, it usually is about something else, as in sacrifice or submission or rebellion, enlightenment. So authors, again, they don't describe, when I'm talking about works of literary merit, authors don't describe eating, they don't describe weather, they don't describe objects in lengthy detail, and just the same, they wouldn't describe issues about sex or male and female romanticism unless it was there to symbolize other larger concepts. So we will see a few stories that sort of indirectly are about masculinity and femininity. We will see characters who are romantically related, but it doesn't necessarily, those issues are open to interpretation. So you want to be thinking about the relationship, thinking about the ways that the characters are described, and looking for the symbolism and the meaning underneath. Okay, water oftentimes can be related to enlightenment, baptism, sort of the idea of going under and then resurfacing with some kind of new rebirth or new outlook on life. If characters go underwater and then they resurface, a lot of times it's maybe not related or used in a very religious sense, but it can be important as far as the character coming to some sort of epiphany. If a character goes under the water and stays under the water, that might be about death. If they're literally dying, but it still could be about rebirth. Many stories have feature characters who go underwater, but they are either choosing to enter a new, different life in the life beyond death, or they're leaving their old life behind. So all the time, water is used in that way, oftentimes to indicate some sense of transition. Rain can also be connected in this way, can also indicate enlightenment. Okay, and then lastly, I just want you guys to think about seasonal stories that take place in different times of the year. Again, spring oftentimes connected to fertility and life and happiness. The fall, oftentimes connected to rewards and punishments, reaping what we sow. Fall is also a time that precedes the death of winter, so that can be important. Winter, a lot of times about hibernation or death or paralysis, unless we're talking about a Christmas story, in which case it's going to be about childhood and birth and hope. So when we read a Christmas carol later in the year, that will be the case there. All right, and look for any times authors are ironic about their use of these common seasons. April is the cruelest month, is the beginning of a very famous poem. And the first thing you see when you read that sentence is, why would April be the cruelest month? Usually we think of April as being happy and about life and growth. So the idea that it could be cruel is the first clue to the meaning of that entire poem. Okay, guys, so that's it for today. Please be ready to use this PowerPoint for tomorrow's lesson. We will be applying it to kind of a practice short story just to get things going to begin the year. All right, that's it for today. I'll see you guys tomorrow.